With Eli Schalit in Caesarea on November 14th, 2008. Why don't you start by telling me a little bit about your family history, growing up?
The number of families which settled in Rishon LeZion to form the first settlement of the new Israel. Those families were not kibbutz type. Mostly came from middle class and upper class Jewish families. There were 17 families who, except perhaps for my grandfather, knew absolutely nothing about agriculture. But they made the decision that coming back to the homeland to reestablish it required, to begin with, a number of settlements which would furnish food to the settlers. And we're not talking about an age like today, in which if you need 100,000 tons of flour, the American government opens up its stocks in Norfolk, Virginia, and loads up 100,000 tons of flour without any difficulty. In those years, what the territory involved did not produce just wasn't really available. Of course, you could get sardines, I assume. You could get some wines, some whiskey. You could get products that were easy to transport and were made available by individual importers who did not really get rich on the assignment, but did help to add some color to local life. Aside from the fact that there was local production, I mean, olives were always grown. Were grown here from biblical times. There are 5 trees here at this corner that come from my grandfather's first olive grove that was built after the destruction of the temple in Judea. These 5. If you look at this book, Anshe Adama, written by Moshe Smilansky, who was really, in many ways, the father of modern Israeli agriculture, you'll find there a chapter describing my grandfather and his activities, and describing him really as he being the first agricultural expert of the Yishuv. We were at the stage of early settlement.
So you were talking about your grandfather?
Yes.
What his name was?
Eliezer Elchanan Shalit, the same name I have. I was born 6 years after he died. He died from cancer. He had been taken by one of my aunts to Berlin during the First World War, because another aunt of mine had married a German Jewish doctor who was a major in the German medical corps. And since my grandfather got this cancer and there were no medical experts in a subject, I don't think around the world, certainly not in Palestine, the decision was made to take him to Istanbul, and from Istanbul to Berlin, and he died in Berlin. I succeeded at the time the communists were in Berlin to buy the possibility of removing his coffin from the Jewish cemetery in the communist side of Berlin to Rishon LeZion. We have a family plot there. The 17 families that founded Rishon have the top of the hill of the cemetery in Rishon. And one of the plots is my family's, and about, I think, 11 members of the family are already buried there. I have the great pleasure of being able to walk past the piece of land that had been assigned to me. And if I so wish, I can even spit on it. But we were so closely involved with this very special moment that whatever happened, and a number of things happened. My grandmother, who had already had 3 children before coming to Palestine, gave birth to a girl, and because of the conditions that existed, there was hardly habitation. They lived in tents to begin with. The child died. And in one of the publications of Rishon LeZion, there is one publication that's devoted to the women of Rishon, where this event of the death of my so-called aunt is told. By the way, this was published by Rishon. And as you can see, this is very fine leather. A descendant of a Rishon family got title in England, Sir somebody, and turned out to be very loyal to his past. And among other things that he did, I donated the greater part of the real estate that was needed to build the museum of Rishon. If you have the opportunity, go and visit it. The big building of the museum is Bet Shalit. You can see what's being presented there in the history of the colony. We called it colony at that time, not Yishuv. And let's see. This is my grandfather.
Mm-hmm. What was their name before Shalit?
It's been Shalit since the 11th century.
Really?
Mm-hmm. We are one of the 25 plus, almost 40 families which settled in Venice at the time of the Crusades. At the time of the Crusades, the various crusade groups, which were organized in a number of countries in Europe, would attack Jewish communities, take what they could in things of value, and use the money in order to finance their expeditions to the Holy Land. And where my family lived at that time, and as you probably know, the Ashkenazi Jewish community is a descendant of Jewish mothers, Jewish women, and Roman officers and soldiers. The 10th and the 3rd Roman legions, which actually subdued Judea, were after Metzadah, were moved with their wives and children to Germany, to the Rhine Valley area, rather than being brought back to Rome. The reason why this was done was the Romans had had enough complications. The Romans had assigned the job of policing the Rhine Valley, which was the principal supplier of food to Rome, oddly enough, to these two crack legions of Rome, which had captured Judea and allowed, they were quite liberal about this, allowed these Roman, both officers and ordinary soldiers to bring the Jewish wives, which they took when they were in Judea, to Germany, rather than bring them to Rome. They were concerned about what such a group could do to upset some of the political situations which they had. At a given moment, after about 25 to 30 years of this settlement, the wives, the Jewish wives, started complaining about the fact that they had no rabbis to look after the communities, including help raise the children. A delegation was permitted to come of women to Rome to present the case to the emperor. They presented it, and the emperor permitted the Jewish community of Germany, which consisted mostly of these women, to bring a number of rabbis to the Rhine Valley. So that when the decision was made by the Christian church in Germany to mount the first the organizing of the first groups that would undertake the crusades to the Holy Land, there was already a background in existence which translated itself into specific steps that were taken. For instance, there were Jewish families that lived in German towns in which they either had factories or shops or did other things except agriculture. Jews were not involved in agriculture at that time. And these paid the nearest thing to what you would call a tax to the prince or other ruler of the area. And that way they bought the freedom to live there. There were other Jewish settlements in which the majority of the population was Jewish. And for the German Christian hordes that wanted to take over Jewish properties and turn them into money for the Crusades, for them to attack communities like that was a little easier because there was no resistance from Christians. The settlement from which my family came had developed a trade with the town of Venice and had some strong relationships with the Prince of Venice who ran his little empire. So when the crusade started and all this business of using the Jews for a purpose developed, this group decided to send a delegation to the prince to see if they could buy a small island which was on the north side of the main island of Venice and use it to settle their families. The Prince of Venice was a great lover of money, and this appealed to him. So he gave permission for a price for the families, which at the end turned out to be almost 50 families. And they moved over to Venice. They settled in Venice and they developed quite a thriving community. And there's something connected with that settlement that is not unimportant. The Jews discovered that they had a problem with the Sabbath. To go from the little island, which, by the way, today is the ghetto there, to go from that little island to the big island at any time, you had to take a boat. And for religious Jews to take a boat, you couldn't do that on the Sabbath because it required work. So the Chachamim of the Jewish community came up with a solution which the prince accepted. They asked the prince to allow them to throw stones in that body of water between the two islands. And he allowed them to do it. In just over 2 years, they filled that stretch of water between the two islands. And from that point onwards, they were able to go across from the small island to the big island on Sabbath and the holidays. And don't fall off your chair. This is the origin of the name of the Jewish quarters in European cities called ghetto. Ghetto comes from the Italian gettoni, stones. Do you follow? And I would bet that if you took 1,000 Jews and put that question to them, where does the word ghetto come from? They wouldn't know anything about it. And this name, this word, has played such a major role in Jewish life. And you ask yourself, how come the explanation had not been provided to a school kid when he reached the age of 6, you know? And it's a fact, this is what's happened. There are very few Jews who know the origin of the name ghetto. Gettoni, stones. But, you know, we've had lots of stones in our history.
Why don't you tell me a little bit about where you were born, when you were born, growing up?
I was born in Jerusalem. I had the privilege of being born in the Holy City, on Russian Square. The hospital I was born in had been a Russian monastery right across the square from the Russian church on Russian Square. And it had been a home for 300 monks, Russian monks. Russian monks and what do they call these female
Nuns?
Nuns. Russian monks and nuns are not, they don't have a life discipline identical to the monks of the Spaniards and the French and the Italians. It's a more liberal type of discipline. And when I was born together with a twin sister, my parents had already hired one of the Russian sisters, they were called, rather than nuns, from the Russian sisterhood to look after us. And she stayed with us until the age of 5. And in the first 5 years, we spoke a mixture of Hebrew and Russian. Today I don't speak a word of Russian, but I know a few words here and there. But this is what we were obliged to do because the nurse that looked after us, this was her language, and she spoke that language to us. My father was a physician, and he was one of the first physicians of the Hadassah group. He was also a physician of the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, which were the first Jewish brigade that joined the British. Had developed its historical record. The majority of the people in the medical unit were either members or were organized by Hadassah in the United States, and they brought them to Alexandria, to Egypt, in order to form the medical unit that would assist the British in capturing Palestine. And I lost my father early in my life, so that he didn't really play a role in my life. He was not a native Israeli. My mother was. And I spent the first 10 years of my youth in Tel Aviv, of which 5 years I was at the Gymnasia Herzliya. Gymnasia Herzliya in Tel Aviv on Rehov Achad Ha'am, where the big skyscraper was built. Was the leading school in the country at the time, and being in Tel Aviv, people who could afford it sent their kids to the gymnasia. I later, after the age of 10, I had personally requested my family to allow me to attend the Reali school in Haifa. I had friends who had gone to that school, and we used to visit Haifa quite regularly, and I saw what was going on at that school, and they had Dr. Biram, the founder of the Reali, established a boarding school as part of the Reali for mainly kids from the colonial settlements. I was there with a minimum of about 28 or 30 kids from the settlements, including Rishon LeZion, Rehovot, Gedera, Rosh Pina, from the settlements. And that was quite good for me also, as I think it was for the others, because we virtually all had the same background. And I must say that my years at the Reali were among the best years of my life, because Dr. Biram, who founded the Reali and ran it, ran a school that gave students the appetite to learn. He was an educator of a very high order. He had been a captain he was a German Jew who had been sent by the Germans to Turkey to assist the Turkish army in its battle against the Allied forces. And he was captured by the British when the British took the area just south of Afula. And he was with a team in Afula itself, and he didn't feel like retreating with the Turks, and he and this small Jewish team, about I think 10 people, hid in the big containers of garbage that were used there, so that when the British came, they could just open the door and walk out. And there had been connection for a number of reasons between these Jews who were in the Turkish units and the Jewish units who were with the Allenby group. So that Dr. Biram always liked to claim that he joined Zionism from the garbage pail. And he allowed you to interpret that any way you wanted. Yeah. He was an enormous fellow. I'll tell you only one small story. In my class were several of the leading officers of what later on became the Israeli army. The first chief of staff of the Israeli army was Yaakov Dori. Yaakov Dori was the first graduate of the Reali school in Haifa. In my class, aside from me, were two chiefs of staff, Chaim Laskov and Mordechai Maklev. We all sat together. Maklev and Laskov joined the British forces during the course of the Second World War. I also joined the British, but I had gone to military school before the war started in Texas. I received a special assignment.
Wait, what year was this? When did you finish high school?
1936.
You finished high school in 1936?
I finished sixth grade, which enabled me to take entrance examination at the military school in Texas and be admitted.
What were you doing in Texas?
Texas had the only cavalry school left in America, and I wanted to go to a cavalry school.
Okay.
An infantry school didn't interest me.
So how old were you?
I was 15. I passed the exams, was admitted. My roommate was a Mexican who was the son of the governor of Saltillo in Mexico. And I became very friendly with these Mexicans, and it turned out that in the town of Saltillo, in northern Mexico, there were descendants of the Anusim who were forced to leave Spain and ended up at the time of the discovery of Mexico and the conquest of Mexico as part of the Spanish army that conquered northern Mexico. And they settled in Saltillo. I'll tell you, it was a story second to none. Today, there are two girls, descendants from those families, living here in Israel. One of them lives in Rishon LeZion. This is part of the history of our people. if you go to the colonial building, the first colonial structure, European structure that was built in Mexico City, which was, so to speak, the governor's palace, there are paintings of the first officers that were appointed to run Mexico. There isn't a face there that doesn't look like Yerushalayim. They all look like Jews who had just come away from the yeshiva. And it was logical. You're talking 1492, huh? It was logical that Jews would flock to this kind of possibilities rather than have no life. I mean, if you left Spain, as you were obliged to do, if you didn't want to convert, then you had to find employment in order to eat. So they wouldn't join as buck privates, but they sure joined as officers and as commanders. And if you ever have a chance to visit Mexico City, go and see that display. I'll tell you, we stood there, my wife and I, we were full of tears. That's the faith of our people. Well, anyway.
You finished Reale?
Yeah.
And then you went to
I finished the 6th in the Reale, and I took the entrance exams to Texas.
To where in Texas?
Texas A&M. That's about 90 odd miles north of Houston. Mm-hmm. And it was then a military school with a heavy contingent devoted to cavalry, which suited me fine because I loved riding, and I used to do a good bit of jumping there. And okay. That enabled me to come back to Palestine.
How long were you there?
I was there for 3 semesters. That was the course, the military course. I came back to Palestine before World War II. I was stationed in Kalmania, which is between Ramat HaKovesh and Kfar Saba. And I continued to do what I could do. And then one day, I happened to be on the beach in Aryeh, which had just been established a couple of years before. And lo and behold, there comes an illegal immigrant ship with 150 illegal immigrants on board. And it didn't take a couple of hours, and the British surrounded it. And they gave me the privilege of spending a couple of days in Akko at the prison.
You were helping the...
I wasn't. By complete coincidence, I happened to have been there on the beach. And to release me took a little bit of doing, because they didn't like somebody from our families being involved in illegal immigration. And Yaakov Dori, who at that time was the commander of the Haganah in Haifa, negotiated through third parties my release on condition that I go to England. They were very concerned about my military training in the States. So they didn't insist on my devoting some time to the prison in Akko, provided I would leave. And I had to go directly from the prison to the ship and then go on to England, where during the first year of the war, I was at the University of Reading, doing 1 year academic work in order to avoid being in prison in Akko. So I chose the, what do they call it? The German raids on London and on Reading and some other towns, as against being in prison in Akko. Some choice, huh?
And your family was, at this time,
When I went to England, accompanied me was my mother and my twin sister. And we all got stuck because the war broke out. As we were going, crossing from France to England, at that moment the war broke out. And then you couldn't leave.
אני רוצה גם לשאול שאלה רגע.
Yes.
back to English.
Yeah. The incarceration in Akko was quite peculiar. I mean, it wasn't really a modern American prison or not even a modern British prison. Generally speaking, groups of people who belonged in a movement or belonged in a gang or something like this would be put together in a room, and there were rooms in which there were 10, 15 people. And you know, there were all these operations that were carried out. I was only there for a couple of days, so that I didn't really gain too much. But the governor of the prison, after I was admitted, asked me to come to his office, and two soldiers took me to his office, and he said to me, I was very surprised. He said to me, "We've had word that you are not just an ordinary terrorist, and that apparently there had been some misunderstanding in connection with your capture. So we agreed that you wouldn't have to do ordinary work while you are here, but you could go and assist the librarian in order to help him look after the prison library." Can you imagine such a fate? So it's not that I didn't have any other sessions in some prisons in later years, but that was only in the course of discharging my duties. And I'm not, I wasn't a prisoner type, you know. And the British particularly showed some respect to people who came from an educated background, from better families. And the assumption was made that I wasn't just, didn't belong to the shabab of the Arab towns. Because there was a huge difference between the Jewish prisoner and the Arab prisoner.
The Jewish prisoners that were in Akko were from the Etzel and the Lehi?
Well, I'll tell you, I don't know why somebody developed the myth that only Etzel and Lehi were the ones who were involved in the Jewish defense activities. Yeah. There were Israeli Jews who came from other quarters who were there, who had been caught. There was a mixture always there in Akko of individuals who were caught, for instance, carrying weapons, and in individuals who participated in a group that defended a settlement. So that individuals were caught and groups were caught. And there was no insistence on making a selection of one specific group. It's true that the Beitar, the Israeli right, had a number of officers, particularly, most of them of German and Polish origin, whose outlook on life required hostility. They did not understand how to defend the Jewish right, so to speak. I don't mean the political right, the Jewish right to exist. how to defend the Jewish right except with violence. And they included even some German Jews with titles of doctor who had been to universities and were educated, and they just, Arlazorov was assassinated by a Jew. He was not assassinated by either an Arab or an Englishman. And I knew the group from which the assassin came. One of the best families in Tel Aviv, German Jews.
When you were in England, you were taking university, you were attending university?
Reading, yeah, University of Reading.
And how long were you there?
1 year.
And then?
Then I received a visa to go back to the States because I had been to the military school. And my mother and sister, who were stuck with me in England, as a result received also a visa enabling them to go back, to go to the States. But because of them, I had to go with them via Brazil and wait in Brazil for them to get visas. And, friends in the United States who were close to the government, they arranged for the visas for my mother and my sister based on the fact that I was going back, and I was received again at Texas A&M in a military school. That's how I got back. But I didn't stay there very long because after one semester, the British announced that they would allow Palestinian Jewish students to go to Canada and join the forces in Canada, either infantry, medical units, or the Air Force. And I volunteered together with 5 others to join the Air Force, RCAF.
Then you went to Canada to do...
Yeah, to try and see if I could join the war as a military man in the Air Force. And I commanded the initial training school unit that I was attached to. And unfortunately, at a given point, there was an epidemic. I was in hospital for close to 3 months. And after that, ruled as being incapable of continuing in uniform. And they offered me the choice of going to university in Canada at the expense of the Canadian government or in the States. They paid for my education. They were very pleased with the service that I gave them in a short period of time. And I was really, to some extent, the only one who was trained. The others had not been trained. I mean, I was Haganah trained, and I was also Texas A&M trained. So that I had military training, and I was able to take over units and drill them properly. But then when, after this sickness hit us, this was a devastating thing. I was almost 4 months in hospital. I survived. I am today 87.
You went then to university, you went to the States?
Then, at the end of the war, I went to Baton Rouge and attended Louisiana State University. I chose the subject that really interested me, which was agriculture. I graduated from LSU. And virtually a week before my graduation, I was called upon to come and do service for the homeland.
What happened? Who called you?
I received a call from the president of the Palestine Economic Corporation, Robert Zold, who told me, he was a family friend, told me that they would like me post haste in Jerusalem. I said, why? He said, because Rechavia Levin Epstein, who headed the Palestine Economic Corporation enterprises in Israel, which included the Dead Sea, had been assassinated in Cairo. I didn't ask what the reason was, and he said they need someone to take his place, and the decision was made by several members of the board of the Palestine Economic Corporation that I was the suitable guy for this job. So they sent me a railroad ticket. You're talking end of World War II. You couldn't take a plane at that time from New Orleans to New York, by picking up a telephone. They sent me a wagon lit railroad ticket, that's a sleeping car ticket, to spend 2 nights taking trains to New York. Would you imagine? And this was a privilege, because the cost of a sleeping car ticket was beyond what I used to get a subsidy from the Canadians for a whole year. It was one of the funniest experiences I ever went through. I wasn't all that, I wasn't persecuted on the train, because sitting in the next compartment was a young lady from the French Louisianian community in the Mississippi Valley, and I amused myself tremendously. I said to myself, the good Lord decided to give me a very special gift, and nobody spat on me. I was really, the young lady liked me. I liked the circumstances. The food on those trains was first class. I arrived in New York half dead, but I had earned my fatigue. And Robert Zoll then told me that they want me to spend a couple of months in their offices in New York in order to learn what the organization was all about and to learn the organizational procedures. So I really enjoyed it. And after 2 months, Robert Zold called me at my office at the PEC, at the Palestine Economic Corporation. He was the chairman. And he said to me, they want to see you at the offices of the Jewish Agency on Madison Avenue. I said, what do you mean they want to see me? He said, I was requested to ask you to go and see 2 or 3 of the ministers who are there. One was Eliezer Kaplan. Another one was Moshe Sharet. And a third one was, trying to remember his name. I'll remember it in the course of our conversation. Anyway, I took a taxi to the Jewish Agency office. was admitted immediately. And this is what they tell me. They tell me that they had negotiated with the Palestine Economic Corporation my release of me to them. I said, wouldn't it have been a good idea to discuss this with me first before you negotiate? So they said the situation is very serious and no one has the luxury of not responding to what the hour requires. I said, what does the hour require? So they tell me that 2 weeks before arrived in New York a gentleman by the name of Chaim Slavin. Chaim Slavin was the chief engineer of the Palestine Electric Corporation, the greatest engineer Israel ever had. Russian Jew, born in the Ukraine, who is the genius who put up the electrical facility of the state. But he put it up already before World War II. And he had been appointed to set up the munitions industry of the new state that was to become a reality shortly.
What is this now? What year is this?
This is just before independence. So they said to me that Chaim Slavin is an engineer, and his ability to handle American procurement, shipping, and things of that sort is rather limited. And besides, even if he wanted to devote time to learning it, he has too much to do in connection with the assembly of munitions manufacturing equipment that has to be brought to Palestine as soon as possible, so that there has never been a thought of having him get involved in transport. So I said, well, this is all very logical, but why me? I don't mind receiving an assignment, but I'd like to know why specifically was I chosen for the job. So the answer that I got was, Eli, we looked at the horizon and we couldn't find anybody as qualified as you. I said, where did you ever find evidence of my qualification? So the answer that I got was, we have checked around. So I said to myself, this is a new nation in the making, a new government in the making, a new army in the making. So you can allow a bunch of enthusiasts to crown themselves as ministers and as messengers of God. And since I didn't have the rank at that point, I couldn't argue. So I said, can we make a simple agreement? So they said to me, we don't make private agreements. So I said, what would happen if I, for instance, make a big mistake? So the answer was, we either forgive you or we kick you out. This was the language. So I said, well, I am beginning to understand what the lay of the land is. So they said, Chaim Slavin is waiting for you. Here's his telephone number, call him and start moving because there's a lot to be done. So I said I would, of course, have to go back to the PEC, the Palestine Economic Corporation, and tell them what's happened. You must remember, I never saw the back end of a ship. I didn't know what this type of transport was all about. I didn't know what transport was all about. When I was, the education, the last education I got was agriculture. So Chaim Slavin had an office within 3 blocks of Columbia University on the Upper West Side. I went up there to see him. There was a chair next to his desk and he says to me, "Shev." I sat down. He wasn't as tall as I was, so, you know. If he were, there would have been any chutzpah or anything of the sort, I could have knocked his teeth out. But he says, "Shev." Okay, yashavti. And then he said to me, "I've been told by people who have known you when you were much younger that you are not only honest, but you are always prepared to undertake assignments." So I said, "Who the bloody hell told you this story?" So he says to me, "Yaakov Dori." So I said, "In that case, I cannot dispute it." Well, I took on this job, and as you probably know, I don't know if you've seen, in that, well, I'll show you a couple of documents. You've seen the book that was written,
The pledge.
The Pledge. There is this letter from Dori in it. Hold it. Force House published this. I believe they have an inscription.
Yep.
Air Force House. As you probably know, I was a founder of the Air Force House in Herzliya. Have you been there?
I've not yet been there.
You have committed a sin.
Uh-oh.
So this is how it got started. And after that, he used to want to massacre me every once in a while. The worst sin that I committed for him was I refused to take buses. He felt that the treasure of the Jewish people had to be carefully guarded. And I said to him, "Chaim Slavin, with the kind of work that I've been ordered to do, the worst thing I can do is to enter a public vehicle." I said, "There are going to be plenty of individuals who would love to be close to me in a public vehicle. So why do you want to risk it?" He said, "I've never heard of such a thing." I said, "You've been an engineer all your life, and you come from Ukraine. How could you have heard of such a thing? So you're in a new world, and we are now dealing with a new country. You have to allow for these things that are completely alien to you, but they do exist." He couldn't understand it, never understood it. And when I had to take some government official or some Jewish police officer in New York to an expensive meal and that sort of thing, he used to say to me, "Don't you feel guilty about spending public Jewish money on expensive meals when a good sandwich would do?" You understand? And then this man built the most outstanding military manufacturing establishment of the post-war period. I mean, I don't know if you saw last week, the Indians are buying from us fighter planes. And this is not a TAS project today, but its origin was TAS. Our military manufacturing is of some serious dimension. I mean, we wrote the Bible, but we also wrote military production in a post-war period. And the Americans always keep teams coming in and out of Israeli munitions factories of every kind in order to learn what we have developed that's worth copying.
So, why don't you tell me a little bit about what it was that you were doing in the United States, what your responsibilities were, and how you went about it, how you knew what to do.
Well, a definition of how I knew what to do is very easy. I notified Chaim Slavin at the time that I was not interested in getting involved in procurement. Give you an example. At one point, a decision was made to buy up one of 3 plants, manufacturing plants, that built cannons, that built guns of all sorts, in New Haven, Connecticut. And these plants had been put on the market by what was at that time called the War Assets Administration. I used to receive information from Slavin from time to time on what future plans were being made so that I could also program shipping facilities in due course ahead of time. So there were these 3 plants in New Haven, and in Bridgeport also there were some plants, and at a given moment, Slavin says to me, the plant that manufactures cannon is in Bridgeport, and I would like you to come with me in order to see what the equipment looks like. He said, we have lists and we have descriptive literature on the equipment, but I'd like to see it with my own eyes. So I suggested that I contact one of the leading Jews of the area there, so as to not attack this issue wildly, and then with rumors spreading about who came, particularly Slavin was born Russian, and when he used to show up in some places in the United States, there was always some fear that something is cooking that is not in the interest of the United States. So he agreed that I prepare this Jew in Connecticut, and Slavin spoke in such a thick accent, both Hebrew and English, the little English he knew. Slavin was a blonde Russian Jew, tough as nails. Who knew a lot of words in a number of languages, but the word no he never heard of. And the kind of judgment that he used in order to solve certain problems was such that I, after a very short while, understood why Yaakov Dori insisted that Slavin be involved with me in connection with the shipment of his equipment. I mean, we're talking here about shiploads of stuff. Can you imagine coming back from some operation in Piers of Brooklyn, in which, to some extent, there was a danger of risking your own life there. There were gangsters who were always interested. If they saw any operations that they think were illegal, they were glad to come close to see if they could get some envelopes out of it. So I came back from one of these operations in which some equipment was loaded on a ship in Brooklyn. Some bullets fell to the ground. And one of my men who was there immediately got in touch with me to tell me what had happened. I dashed down. For some strange reason, the good Lord decided to do something good for his Jewish people. No hostile people saw what had dropped there on the ground. And I just picked it up and I put it into a briefcase in Fini. But I came from this incident to see Slavin. And the fellow says to me, we've got to go to Bridgeport and see the equipment and see what we would do with it. So I said, have you bought it? He said, we've given an option and we were told that our option was acceptable. I called up the connection in Bridgeport, a Jew who really ran the town. One of those situations in which you have somebody of that nature. He had the large construction company, the large timber group, and he said that he knew the people there very well, and that he could most probably tell them that there are people who are interested in purchasing some of the equipment and that they have been approved by Washington, which was a fact. And would they allow us to come and inspect the equipment? So I drove Slavin up to Bridgeport and we started going from one piece of machinery to another. We come to one piece of machinery and he says to me, and this machine, he says, don't ship to me the bottom part before you ship the top. A very important moment in this whole program. I said to him, Chaim, I have never been to an engineering school. I don't know what is the top part of the machine, and I don't know what is the bottom part. You cannot come and ask me not to ship the bottom part before I ship the top part, or vice versa. I wouldn't know which is which. You call it bottom part, and somebody else might be calling it something else. So I said, Chaim, we can't do business this way. What we have to do is, you've got to allow me to take on a man that you will approve, who understands such machinery, and then we put a small number on each piece of equipment, and then I arrange to ship by the numbers.
Meaning you would break down this piece of equipment?
No, not necessarily.
Okay.
Yeah, it depends. Some equipment we had to break down because you just couldn't do it that way. But to give you an example, I shipped out a large number of fighter planes. You know how? To begin with, there wasn't a fighter plane that I was prepared to ship unless one or two of my people would observe what's going on around that fighter plane for several days in order to make sure that the thing is not under observation.
Who purchased the fighter plane?
We had various purchasing agents. In connection with the fighter plane program, Nat Cohen was the great buyer. He was one of the great heroes of Israel. Never got acknowledged as such, but that's what he was. He knew what to buy. He was a fighter pilot from World War II, and he knew what aircraft was worth buying and what was not. He would test virtually every aircraft before he would buy it. So I said, don't give me general rules. I said, in order to advance the program, you have to give me specific rules which I can pass on to other people who are qualified and who can take these rules that you have laid down and use them intelligently in order to achieve the optimum result. But any attempt to leave engineering knowledge to people who had never been trained as engineers, and specifically as ones who can identify not only this equipment but every part connected with it, is an invitation to disaster. I want to tell you, Chaim Slavin and I were very close personal friends. He was much older than I was, but he had been the chief engineer of the Palestine Electric Corporation. I mean, he built the electric facility of Israel. And he wasn't accustomed to being contradicted. I said to him, Chaim, I am prepared to stand before any court of justice. If I give you the advice, not the instruction, I give you the advice that it's against the interest of Israel to ship a piece of equipment, you do not have the authority to reject my opinion. And this is how we operated between us, and this is why we succeeded.
You were going to tell me how you shipped the fighter planes.
So, as I said, the arrangement was for one or two of my men to observe any one plane that had to be shipped over a period of time to make sure that it's under no observation of any either hostile or friendly party, and if it's a friendly party, we had to clearly establish it was a friendly party. Then once it's been established, the time had to be found, either at night or some other time, in which it could be moved. Let us say if it was in an airport in Georgia, to be moved to, in most cases, an airport in the vicinity of New York or Boston or Philadelphia, in that area. Once it had been moved, the question was whether we succeeded in moving it to a friendly, small airport which was under our control through friendly parties, or we succeeded in moving it to a place in which the best thing we could do is just dismantle the aircraft, take the wings off and so forth. And then I requested two of my assistants to look at various loading operations for Israel that were being carried out in the ports in the New York area, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and other ports all the way up to Boston, starting with Philadelphia. What I wanted to know was how were aeroplanes being shipped by other parties abroad? And I discovered that aeroplanes that were going by license from Washington were either flown or were dismantled and put into large boxes which were either completely covered by wood, the boxes, or they just sort of were placed inside what is a frame of a box, so that you could lift it with a crane and place it on a ship either inside or on deck. So I figured this wasn't practical. I then asked the boys to see if there are similar sized boxes that were being shipped that did not include aircraft. And one of the boys came up with some information, a fellow from the Bronx, because there were a couple of docks that we were using close to the Bronx. Came up with the information that some aircraft were being shipped out of where he was in very large boxes. So I said, well, that's nothing new. He said, at the same time, he saw several boxes, same size, completely closed, which had a large image on the side, on both sides, with an inscription, International Harvester. Those were the big combines. So I said, if we would have been Gentiles, I would say to you, to this young fellow who discovered this, that you deserve to get the Victoria Cross. From that point onwards, we started shipping what my good friend was buying and delivering in boxes with the full big inscription, International Harvester. Not one single one was ever caught. It's a fact. And when these used to arrive in these docks, you know, of course everybody opened his eyes and nobody ever dreamt that there were aircraft inside. You follow? Mm-hmm. This was no heroics. This was just the exercise of logic and which resulted from the fact that we had our back to the wall and we couldn't afford to make a mistake. And this way, all these planes got in, but we had other cases. I can tell you, I loaded a ship with tanks, for instance, with tanks, complete shipload, a Liberty ship, complete with tanks in Manila. And the manifest didn't say Manila Harbor to Tel Aviv. It gave another destination.
Now, it was legal to acquire these, or not legal to acquire them at all?
We didn't acquire anything illegally.
But the transport of it was?
The delivery to the war zone.
Was illegal.
That was the point.
Were you concerned? Were you
No,
nervous?
not really. Not really. Everything was done with such tight order that you could always retreat.
Who did you report to?
The majority of the activities that I've described, almost all, were for Chaim Slavin, the military industry.
Was he running the operation in the United States, or was somebody that he had to?
He spent most of his time in procurement in the United States. After he finished the procurement program, he returned to Israel.
What about Hotel 14? Was that?
Hotel 14 was a different chapter entirely.
Mm-hmm.
Hotel 14 was a mixture of of politics and professionalism. Teddy Kollek had his last office in America in penthouse of the Hotel 14. The Hotel 14 was owned by a Jewish couple, which couple had actually worked for the procurement at a given point, and then bought this hotel and offered its use to the rising Israel, so to speak. As I said, Teddy Kollek had his office up there. I used to visit it very infrequently because of fear of observation. There was no sense in running a risk. And there was, in a setup such as we had with the Jews of the early Hashomer HaTzair having a claim on history, which they considered entitled them to hobnob and get information, to members even of Etzel.
Who funded your operation?
The Jewish Agency, until the state was established, was of course the official group that did the funding. I never got involved in the funding. All I did was just provide documentation as to what was necessary, and then they had a number of men who were involved specifically in the funding and who handled it well. The funding, this was one case in which the funding was not mishandled, in my opinion.
Did you have any connection to people like Rudolph
Sonnenborn? Sure. He had connection to me, more than I had connection to him. But I mean, as you know, there was the Assembly of the Wise. There were some 20 wealthy Jews who put money on the table. I'm talking about cash money on the table. Millions, in order to carry out specific operations. And they used to meet regularly in Sonnenborn's quarters in New York. And from time to time, people like myself would be invited in order to give some required information. And these people saw to it that the critical sums of money that were necessary for the conduct of the war was always available on the table. It was a fantastic performance.
What are your recollections of them, or what, thinking about what they had done in terms of being involved in financing what, to some extent, was an illegal operation?
They used to receive, and I saw to it that this is the way it was handled. Teddy Kollek was involved in some other procurement activities which were different than what I was involved in. But I always submitted whatever was necessary in a given fashion. I had learned the character of the Americans, and I knew who we were dealing with. And I must tell you, I found the devotion to the cause of Israel from these guys who were stone wealthy. I mean, I was present on occasions when things like $170 million were approved, and with private commitments. But it couldn't have been done otherwise. How can you buy without means?
Was this group involved in purchasing of Aryeh ships?
They were involved in every purchase. Aryeh ships was again a game run differently. I got involved a couple of times with the Aryeh ships because these were ships, and I was close to the business of ships. So the Exodus I bought. I handled the purchase.
Can you tell me about that?
Because I had the personal connection. From a Jew. I bought it from a Jew. I was recently at a meeting of the Israeli intelligence group in which the men who were on duty at that time followed the development of the Exodus project, and they had never met me personally. So they requested me to come to intelligence headquarters in Tel Aviv. And I supplied them with some facts that none of them had ever had, because they were not involved in the planning, they were only involved in the execution.
Who was it purchased from? How did that come about that you were?
Well, my family had been socially involved with some American Jewish families. I used to quite frequently see them when I could do so, and some of those ladies in those families were interested in marrying their daughters off. So here was an Israeli who was dashing around, short of breath. So I got to know a whole slew of these families personally. I mean, they'd been friends of my parents, not mine. So one of the fellows was a Jew who was, I believe, a member of the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue in New York. And I heard the story that he had purchased a ferry that used to run down from Albany to the New York area, back and forth in the river. And that this ferry was converted during the war to a troop carrier. And that she could no longer serve as a ferry and was available for purchase. I passed the word on to the illegal immigration group, some of whom were friends of mine. And they asked me just to keep an eye and see if a moment will come when a purchase could come into consideration. So a moment came, but not when purchase came into consideration. A moment came when the news was passed on to me that a Jew in New York had bought the ship. He bought the ship and he figured he was going to sell it to somebody for a profit. I was rather sad to tell him that since he had bought it, there was no opportunity for him to make a profit because we needed it for illegal immigrants. You know what he did? He kissed me on my forehead. And I arranged the purchase within 24 hours. And then the illegal immigration group had several of its big operators available for this venture, including David Nameri, who was probably the number one operator of the illegal immigrant ships. And there were a few others.
You know somebody named Ralph Goldman?
Altman?
Goldman.
Goldman? No. There were all kinds of people who claimed later on, even if they were cooks on one ship or another. So there were several other ships that I purchased. The Altalena I purchased.
The Altalena
Yeah.
purchased?
Yeah.
That was, did that sell from the United States?
United States, then went to Mexico, and from Mexico went to the Med. But like in every national movement, you have two types of individuals: the genuine stuff and the near genuine. And a number of these illegal immigrant ship operations were handled by people with very good intentions and very courageous people, but they didn't have the professional know-how to handle such projects.
In the course of your work in the United States, was there anything that didn't go quite right, that almost threatened to put an end to the project?
Who?
that threatened to put an end to
Who?
the, did anything happen while you were working on shipping that could have threatened the whole project, that would have had to made you stop the project? Or everything?
The only serious thing that happened was the capture of the American export line ship in New Jersey.
What happened?
The ship had two shipments. One of dynamite and a second shipment of smokeless powder. The dynamite is the one that caused the problem. As it was loaded onto this American export line ship in Jersey City, one or two drums fell, and the dynamite was discovered. I had the 5 tons of smokeless powder, which is the biggest shipment of smokeless powder that was ever shipped. Smokeless powder is handled in grams, not in pounds. I had consigned the shipment of smokeless powder that was needed by Slavin, badly needed by Slavin, which I purchased. I normally didn't purchase anything, but in Mexico I happened to have had a personal connection there, and I purchased this shipment of smokeless powder and had it loaded onto drums in Mexico, and then sent it by American flag ship, properly disguised in drums, to Jersey City, consigned to South Africa, and then at a given point switched it from South Africa to this American export line ship on deck. And while the dynamite was caught, this was never caught. It reached Israel.
What happened when the dynamite was caught?
The dynamite that was caught?
What happened to the operation when the dynamite was caught?
Well, the attorney acting for the Israeli government took a plane and flew to Houston, Texas, where I happened to be at that moment. And he said to me, "Despite your immaculate record, I've been requested to ask you to assume the responsibility for the dynamite." And I hadn't finished the complete program yet. I was asked to claim that I was responsible for it. I contacted the necessary connections that I had in the business, including Yaakov Dori, and I was told that it's a matter of national necessity. So I said, then what will happen to me after they establish that I was not necessarily involved in this matter, but I was involved in all the others, which they have never been able to put their fingers on. So I was told that's the risk that every soldier takes.
So did you have to leave?
I had to present myself to the district attorney in New York.
And then?
Well, before I presented myself to the district attorney, the fellow from the law office of the Jewish agency who was handling it, who was standing next to me. I don't normally do this kind of thing. But I asked him to turn his face to me before we went up the stairs to the hall there. And I spat in his face. I said, what you're doing is a result of your inability and incompetence. I'm submitting because my own country is involved. But this is more a condemnation of you than it is a condemnation of anybody else. And we had the great fortune that the judge who was handling the case was none other but an Irishman. And you know what he did after he heard all the evidence? He pushed some papers aside. He pointed at me and he said, what this man has done, we know many other nations like the one I come from have had to do in the past. Not guilty. Would you believe it? I have the excerpt from the newspaper. How far are we now? בסדר? זה מאורגן?
כן, אני כבר רץ.
אני הוצאתי את זה מהכיס, יכול מאוד להיות שהזזתי משהו או לא?
לא, לא, זה בסדר.
זה בסדר, אוקיי.
As somebody who was in the United States during this critical time, as somebody Israeli who was there at this critical time, what can you tell me about the mood or the attitude that the average person had toward this whole Zionist enterprise, State of Israel, etc.? Here you were trying to do all kinds of different activities to help the state in the making. What was the atmosphere? What did people think about this venture?
What people are you talking about?
The average, I guess the Jewish community you talked about a little bit, but the people that you were working with on the ports, the people that you were helping to acquire some of these items from. Were these people that were inspired by what was going on in Palestine? Were they indifferent? It was now after the Holocaust, so I'm sure that there was some impact about how people viewed the potential of a Jewish state. Or did you not encounter it that much?
Well, I must tell you, no one could escape getting involved in conversations. It was impossible because it was all in the air. Can you stop? You're talking about a moment in history that has its origins some 4,000 to 5,000 years back. And we had all kinds of experiences as a nation. Egypt was one type of experience, Babylonia was another type of experience. The Muslim countries were another kind of experience, the Christian countries were another kind of experience. So we had experience in handling a good many of these situations, but we also had given up 7 million people just before. Those that went up in the crematorium. And this was still a very heavy wound for which בסדר? So, the special history was such that, you know, people of my background from the early settlement, we found it difficult to come across Jews who spoke like the rightists of the Betar. I mean, we suddenly faced Jews who obviously, because of the tortured Jewish history, developed the mentality of killers. The only good Gentile was a dead one. Attitudes of this sort you came across. Today, the world has changed. And if we would have had to face that same situation today, we are in a totally different condition than we were then. I mean, we had nothing. We had to create everything, but literally nothing. Today, like this thing of 2 weeks ago, with the Indians coming and placing here this huge order for these very special planes that we are building. Who in those years would have ever dreamt that we would, at a given moment, be in this position?
You found yourself probably through these the various experiences in a lot of places where there probably weren't very many Jews or Israelis, in Louisiana and in Texas and probably some of the other places that you were working with acquiring or dealing with some of the shipping. What was the attitude of everyday Americans toward the work that you were doing?
By and large, the majority of Americans who came across situations in which they had to sort of take an attitude on what we were doing, I am among those who was very surprised by the degree to which so many Americans had sympathy for what we were doing. But I mean, we had these shocking revelations like Eisenhower's attitude towards the Jews. I mean, Eisenhower ended up in having revealed himself to have been an out-and-out anti-Semite.
Were there any,
And Roosevelt was no lover of Jews.
were there any moments in this experience that were particularly emotional that you recall? Something that worked, that didn't work, that really...
The emotional moments did not relate really to the arms purchase, assembly, procurement, shipment, and so forth. They did not touch that area. The emotional moments came in totally different areas. We were becoming exposed to the reality of what happened in the camps, and to the plight of the Russian Jews. We were really exposed to tragic situations that were not as severe as the German extermination, but were severe in their own right. And all that my generation would have concluded, and did conclude, was the sooner we establish a national home and have our own borders to defend, and we do so in a qualified fashion, the sooner these problems will come to an end. But I mean, you can't take a 4,000-year-old people and expect them to behave like an African tribe. Impossible.
Do you remember where you were on November 29th, 1947?
Central Park West. I had just finished an operation during the night. I think I got to bed around 4 o'clock in the morning. Tried to reach Tel Aviv. You know, when independence came, when the old man whom I wasn't one of his great admirers, because he had too much hatred in his heart for the Burgani, Ben-Gurion. He hated the Burgani, but he was obliged to go to the Yehudim Burganim in Boston and in New York in order to raise the funds. Strange character. His son went to school with me, Amos. And his son was totally different from his father. And the father was a great Jew and a great Israeli, and he did a great deal. But he was full of traditional hatred. Which you couldn't say, for instance, for someone like Rabin. Rabin was purity itself. He was the cleanest Jewish leader of all time. I mean, David, close to his deathbed, got himself a 17-year-old girl. You couldn't say that about Rabin. I knew Rabin quite well. We had great Jews. Bialik was a great Jew. Another great Jew was Dizengoff, the first important mayor of Tel Aviv. We had some very, very outstanding Jews. Yitzhak Navon, the Sephardic ex-president, is a great Jew. The Polish Jewish ghetto produced a Jew with a mixture of devotion and of hatred.
Looking back 60 years later, how did your involvement in that era make an impact on the rest of your life?
To me, in a certain selfish way, it gave me the feeling that I had fulfilled the assignment that had been given to me, not just by my commanders, but historically. I felt that as a young Jew, with my background, with what I could contribute, I was given an assignment by this fellow upstairs, and I feel that I delivered most of what I was assigned to deliver. And I'm thankful. I feel very much indebted. I believe that the good Lord, having made me a Jew, gave me a big gift. And I've raised my children in that spirit. They also believe that being Jewish is a gift that they had been given. And I believe that that is one of the reasons why we cannot be exterminated. We are wiser than the enemy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.